Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohrenbacher.
And we're back for another social distancing episode.
That's right. And, the cool thing about quarantine is I don't have to wash my clothes as much and can rewear them a few more times.
Quarantine rules, right?
It's good times. But anyway, we have a great show for you. We're going to be talking with a lot of scholars from Reasons to Believe. We're going to be hearing from philosopher and theologian Ken Samples, biochemist Fazale Rana, and astronomer Hugh Ross.
And they're going to be talking about questions like, is Big Bang cosmology in trouble? And what does animal domestication say about human uniqueness? And we might have a special guest.
First up is RTB 101. Krista Bontrager will be talking with Ken Samples, and they're going to be chatting about what happens after we die. And I promise you, it's a hope-filled conversation.
Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about the question, is it okay for me to have doubts about my faith, is philosopher and theologian Ken Samples. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Krista.
Doubts, I'm sure you've experienced this. They can be very unsettling at times. I know I have doubts. I'm sure there's issues that you struggle with. There's parts of the Bible that I wish were more clear. I'm just wondering, after 3.5 decades in the realm of apologetics, Ken, do you ever struggle with doubts?
I do. In fact, I wrote a book entitled Without a Doubt, but I must be a hypocrite because I do have doubts. In fact, Krista, I think that part of being a finite creature means we don't know everything. It's also some of the things we believe are mysterious. And so I don't think it's a bad thing that people have doubts. I think it's important to be able to work through them, but I think it's a natural thing for a thinking person to have doubts.
That's a really good point, because we are finite creatures, and sometimes we do have a tendency to think, well, unless I know everything, how can I really be sure of anything?
Right.
I'm just wondering, what keeps you in the faith? What is it about Christianity that keeps you walking forward in your faith? Because you've been walking with the Lord for a very long time.
Yeah. I grew up kind of a nominal Catholic, and in college, I made a commitment to Christ. And so I've been walking with the Lord for more than 40 years now. I would say two things are very meaningful to me, Krista. From a theological, biblical point of view, I would say, of course, that God's providential grace in my life, the Lord's grace allows me to continue to walk with Him and to walk within grace. I think from kind of a cerebral or intellectual point of view, I find historic Christianity's explanation of reality to be very powerful, to be convincing. I think that Christianity makes sense of the world. It makes sense of me. And so I think the explanatory power and scope of Christianity assures me that I'm on the right track and that I'm encountering truth.
That's really good, because I can relate to that. I know that for me, on the days when I have doubts and struggle, what grounds me is the resurrection, that I have confidence that Jesus really rose from the dead. And if He rose from the dead, that changes everything, because He demonstrates that He has power over the ultimate enemy of death. So you kind of have to have those anchors, I feel like, in your soul that keep you grounded on the days that are difficult.
Well said. I think that the resurrection, and of course, one of the encouraging elements intellectually is that Paul says, the resurrection is potentially falsifiable. If we could discover Christ's body, it would be falsified. So we don't appear to be engaging in myth. We appear to be engaging in historical truths.
Now, there's a lot of conversation happening right now in our culture. We see a lot of examples of Christians who deconvert away from their faith.
Right.
I'm just curious, if you could sit down for coffee with someone who is thinking about deconverting, they've been kind of pummeled by a lot of doubts that just don't seem to have answers.
Right.
What would you want to tell them? Are there even maybe some steps that you might recommend that they do before they deconvert?
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question, and I have thought about that. I think some things that I would say, Krista, is I would want to communicate that, it's common that thoughtful people will have doubts. Again, we're thinking people. Again, we're finite creatures. There are mysterious elements of Christianity. But I think I would also want to maybe drill down a little bit and see what's the source of these doubts. Do you have doubts about the factual underpinning of Christianity? Or are the doubts more emotional, psychological, spiritual in nature? Sometimes people have been hurt, particularly maybe they've had a bad experience in the church, and that can unsettle them. So I'd want to talk with them about what is the source of the doubt, and have you taken any steps to see if maybe there's a way of addressing it effectively? Again, I don't think it's a problem that people have doubts. I think it's very important how you decide to try to address them.
That's a really good point, because having doubts is normal and common. We see people in scripture who wrestle with doubts. The thing is how do we walk through those doubts? And sometimes it can be a very isolating experience where we think we have to sort it out all by ourselves. I think if I was sitting down for coffee with somebody who was thinking of deconverting, I would want to encourage them to start resourcing, with other people that have had similar questions. There's no new questions. So let's find someone who's wrestled through that question and come to a meaningful answer within the context of the historic Christian faith. I think there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from people who have gone before us. So
that's exactly right. And there are people historically who have gone through the dark side of the soul. Important to read some of the great Christian thinkers of the past. And as you touched upon, talking with contemporary people. I mean, I think every church ought to have a class, call it a doubters class, where they could come and say, hey, I got these challenges in my life, or I don't understand how this can be true. I think that would be a great place where a church could invite people who struggle and talk with others who've gone through it.
Thanks, Ken, for sharing that wisdom. And I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't yet done so, go check out Ken's blog. Just go to reasons.org and search for Reflections.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm Sandra Dimes, and this is Falcor, and we're going to be talking about puppies with Dr. Fazale Rana. Thank you for joining us, Fuz.
Sandra and Falcor, thanks for having me.
Well, you know what? You wrote an article that caught my eye right away because it was about puppies or about dogs. And you're talking about animal domestication and how we domesticated wolves into dogs. This article, it was really fascinating because what we learn about animal domestication says something about human uniqueness. So can you tell us about this discovery?
Yeah. Well, it all begins with the discovery of a frozen dog in the Siberian permafrost. And it turns out that this specimen dates at 18,000 years in age. And some of the soft tissue is still preserved. And so researchers were extracting ancient DNA from it with the hopes of gaining insight into the domestication process. And this again, discovery corresponds to the time when we think wolves were domesticated into dogs. And people are very interested in domestication because it's so tightly linked to the emergence of human civilization. So they want to understand what is the genetic basis for turning an animal that is a native wild animal into a domesticated animal that's friendlier, less aggressive, more cooperative. What is that genetic process that takes place to engage in that transition?
And what did they discover about the domestication process?
It turns out that some of the genetic changes center around a particular gene called the BAZ1B gene. And this is a master gene that controls a number of other genes. But it turns out that changes in this gene lead to changes in the anatomy of animals that we characterize and associate with domestication, such like floppy ears, a smaller skull, smaller teeth, and again, curlier tails, but also more friendly, more cooperative, less aggressive. And so the researchers speculated that maybe these changes actually took place in humans as well, accounting for our capacity to engage in complex social structures where we cooperate with each other, where we're friendly with each other.
So this gene that changed both in animals and in humans?
Well, that's the question that these researchers were exploring. And in fact, it turns out that particular gene controls the biology of what are called neural crest cells. These are cells that play a role in embryonic growth and development, and they are cells that will eventually develop into the nervous system. And so they confirm that in humans, this particular gene also controls the development and the behavior of our neural crest cells by looking at cell lines developed from people that have particular syndromes. One's called the Williams syndrome. And then once they confirmed that, they then compared that particular gene in modern humans with those same genes that we see in the Neanderthal and the Denisovan genomes.
So from a naturalistic perspective, is this discovery expected, or does that fit more with a Christian perspective?
Well, what the researchers discovered is that the BAZ1B gene in modern humans is actually very different than we see in Neanderthals and Denisovans. And so this at minimum indicates that human beings really stand apart or stand distinct from the other hominins, including, again, Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And so this is really evidence that human beings are exceptional, are unique compared to other creatures. And our capacity to form complex social structures is something that identifies us as human beings. It seems to be unique to human beings, and it's something that makes us exceptional. So I actually see this as consistent with a Christian worldview.
When we think about a Christian worldview and our exceptionalism, what would we expect to see in addition to what you're saying about animal domestication?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that there's a growing number of physical anthropologists and behavioral anthropologists who really think that human beings really are exceptional. And it's not just simply our capacity to form complex social structures where we cooperate with one another, but it's also our theory of mind and our capacity to characterize the world and ideas with symbols and then to manipulate those symbols. And I see all of these properties as really scientific descriptors of the image of God. So this study really provides affirmation that human beings are exceptional in a way that is compatible with the biblical view of the image of God.
And when we think about like having pets and, just having special relationships with our furry friends, is that something that can be explained from an evolutionary perspective?
Well, it's interesting because when you think about the process of domestication, this is really artificial selection, where we are manipulating microevolutionary processes as human beings in order to produce animals or plants that would be ideally suited to support our lifestyle. And this was critical for the advent of human civilization. And we're really the only creatures that show that have ever existed that have that capacity for domestication. So the mere fact that we're domesticating a whole host of plants and animals in support of our needs as human beings really is another piece of evidence that supports our exceptional nature.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good talking point when we're hanging out with friends or family and they have their furry friends with them. We can talk about just our uniqueness and our ability to domesticate animals and have friendships with them in a sense. So thank you so much for that, Fuzz. If people want to learn more about human uniqueness, where can they go?
Well, I would commend a book called Who is Adam that I co-wrote with Hugh Ross, which is a presentation of the RTB human origin model derived from the biblical text, and show how in this book we show how the discoveries in science support a biblical perspective on humanity.
Thank you so much for that, Fuzz. So if you want to hear more on this topic, go to shop.reasons.org and search Who Was Adam. Bye.
Hello, Jeff Zwaring here, and welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we look at important scientific ideas and interact with how they advance the truth of Christianity. Today, I'm joined by President and founder of Reasons to Believe, Dr. Hugh Ross, and we're going to ask the question, is Big Bang cosmology in trouble? Hugh, it's good to have you here today.
Well, thank you.
So there have been a number of studies come out recently that seem to indicate that Big Bang cosmology might be in trouble, or at least that's the claim. And I know some young Earth creationists have hopped on that and said, oh, we need to be careful of Big Bang cosmology. I guess to kind of set the stage, though, can you kind of just basically describe in a brief way, what are the basic features of Big Bang cosmology?
Well, the basic features are that the universe has a beginning that includes a beginning of space and time, as well as matter and energy, how it continuously expands from this space-time beginning under laws of physics that don't change, or one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay. All those things are actually stated in the Bible, but from a scientific perspective, if you're living in a universe where the laws of physics don't change, where it's expanding, and where you got this pervasive law of decay, that's a universe that gets colder and colder as it gets older and older.
So there are kind of these four basic features. There's a beginning, there's the constant laws of physics, there's this expansion, and the pervasive law of decay. And so this particular discovery that is causing the tension or raising the profile of Big Bang cosmology right now is related to the expansion. So kind of give us some details of what is it that is causing people to have a little bit of concern.
Well, there was a paper published a couple of years ago based on Cepheid variable stars, where they calculated that the expansion rate of the universe based on those stars was 74 kilometers per second per megaparsec. And that was in conflict with a result we got from studying the radiation left over from the cosmic creation event, which is actually looking at the very early history of the universe, and based on those maps, concluding that the expansion rate was only 67 kilometers per second per megaparsec. And in both cases, the error bars were small, so they said, we got a big discrepancy here.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So we've got the Cepheid variables, which are a type of star that pulse basically, and from the duration of the pulse, you can tell how bright they are, which allows you to tell how far away the stars are. And so they use those to measure what?
Well, they measure the radial velocities of these stars, which tells you how fast they're moving away from us, from galaxies. And if you know the distances to the stars, and because these Cepheid variable stars are reasonably good standard candles, you can calculate the cosmic expansion rate. But you're calculating it based on the local universe, and this is in conflict with a calculation based on cosmic background radiation maps that indicates a significantly slower cosmic expansion rate.
So you got these Cepheid variables, which are measuring the local expansion or something more local to us, whereas the cosmic microwave background radiation is measuring the expansion rate very early in the universe history, or rather much further away from us. And these two are in conflict. And so now with that, so with that picture, kind of go back and walk us through the numbers again, so we get a scale of what we're talking about here.
Well, based on the Cepheid variable stars in different nearby galaxies, you get an expansion rate of 74 kilometers per second per megaparsec, where 1 parsec is 3.26 light years.
Okay.
And if you go look at the cosmic background radiation maps, where you're looking at the cosmic expansion rate when the universe is really young, you're getting 67 kilometers per megaparsec. kilometers per second per megaparsec.
Yeah, there's some people who would say, well, that's not that big a deal. But, if you work out the numbers, that translates into a difference in the age, if that's the only thing incorporated. That works out to a difference in age of about 1 billion years. So this is relatively large discrepancy.
Relatively large, and the error bars are quite small on both measurements.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what's caused some concern. And, people are saying, well, dark energy can explain maybe almost 1 kilometer per second, because dark energy predicts the universe will expand more rapidly when the universe is old than when it is young, but it only explains 1 kilometer per second per megaparsec. You got another 6 to deal with, which has caused some scientists to say there must be some hidden physics in the Big Bang that we're missing. And then you got young Earth creationists saying, looks like astronomers have no idea how old the universe is because of how far off these two measurements are, which is why I wrote a blog on this, Jeff, basically saying when something like this is published in the scientific literature, this is usually an indication we're overlooking something. And so I basically point out the things that have been overlooked, and if you pay attention to those 3 things, you actually can explain the difference between the 2 measurements.
No, I think that's very important, and we'll point people towards that blog at the end of the show here. I do think it's interesting to look at this in a little bit of historical context. I mean, you've been aware of this longer than I have, but even back when I was in graduate school, we're now talking about a difference between 67 and 74. When I was in graduate school, those numbers were 50 and 100. So this is not a new thing that we have discrepant measures of the cosmic microwave background. And so in some sense, it seems like this is a vast improvement over where we are, because even back then, the statistical uncertainties were far larger than those results were very discrepant.
Well, back then we had large statistical errors, and the errors were so large we didn't even bother to look at the systematic errors.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the statistical errors are small enough that we're saying, hey, maybe we better pay attention to systematic effects that might be pushing the observations in one direction or the other. And that's kind of what I put on my blog, are the systematics that have been overlooked.
So kind of final question here. When you see a discrepancy like this, where one measurement of something that's essential to Big Bang cosmology says this, and another measurement says something that's different, is this a sign to look and say, well, we don't know what we're talking about? Or is there something that this gives us a clue to bigger and better things in the universe that we can look at?
Well, that's the latter, Jeff, in the sense that we have very strong evidence that the Big Bang creation model is correct from looking, say, at the cooling of the universe, the measurements we have there, the helium abundance, the deuterium abundance. Those are all very strong evidences for Big Bang cosmology. And the fact is, we can see the galaxies moving away from one another as we look at greater and greater distances. So this is a tip-off that we're overlooking some significant effect. And so that should motivate all of us to say, well, what have we overlooked? And if you actually read the scientific papers, the 2 that were published, they both indicated that the fact that we see the discrepancy means we're missing something. And that's an opportunity to learn something about the universe we didn't know before. That should be exciting to everybody. And I thought, what was really gratifying when I went through the scientific literature is like, now we're finding the systematic effects that explain the discrepancy and actually explain it almost perfectly.
Well, thanks, Hugh. I appreciate your comments. It is a common thing in science that when we're looking at how does something work, we often find discrepant results. And as Hugh mentioned, this is an opportunity to explore more deeply and figure out things that we may have not had a window on before. The fact of the matter is, even though there's this discrepancy, there's a whole wealth of data that points to the validity of Big Bang cosmology, and that really points towards a creator. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out Hugh's blog on this. It's called Resolving the Cosmic Expansion Anomaly. We'll give you great tools to understand this particular discrepancy and the opportunities it gives us to learn about the universe, as well as equip you to go out and share the gospel with those who need to hear.
That does it for us this week on 2819. We hope this show has helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
And don't forget, subscribe to the show and search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show.
And if you would like the podcast version of our show, you can get that wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
Bye.